And I would just like to start with some basic things, maybe revisit your academic career. I think it would be good
Okay.
for our readers to find out how your interest in Japanese studies first began. Could you tell me something more about that?
Yes. When I was 12 years old, I think, I found a book in the local public library that introduced the writing of Chinese characters. And I thought, without going into the story, it was a story about a boy in China. But anyway, it was about a missionary boy in China. But I thought the Chinese characters was the greatest thing I had ever seen. And I copied everyone from the book and I wanted to learn. But that was China. So the other thing that I was interested in those days was maps and cartography and things like that. And I just simply found Japan more interesting on the as a as a an item on the map than China. And I knew that they used Chinese characters in Japan, and that was sort of it. So it was very juvenile. Um, but that experience of being captivated by the characters never left me. I always found it interesting. So I started to learn Japanese as soon as I could, maybe mid-teens or so.
Oh,
Studied it in high school and then undergraduate major, and then graduate school was history. So that's the story. History came late. That's the point. Yeah.
yeah, it's a fascinating story. So I presume you visited Japan at some point to work there, to study there.
Yes, yes. After graduating from college, I worked, I taught English for 2.5 years, and then applied to graduate school. And then I did my dissertation research at the University of Tokyo. Um, it's a long time ago now, 40 years. Uh, so that's the mid 80s, early 80s. And then, yeah. And then periodically since then have gone back to Japan for different lengths of time. But that's the story. So I went, yeah, first before school, before graduate school, and then in connection with graduate school and later with research.
Do you remember your first impression of Japan? Did it continue to fascinate you when you saw it so face to
Oh yes.
face?
Yeah. Never bored.
I see.
Not for 1 second. Yeah. Just feel ignorant. That's all. Yeah.
If we go to your book, The Social Sciences in Modern Japan, do you remember what prompted you to write it? What was your first research question?
Um, yeah, I think I said in the one of the introductions that I just somehow realized that the term, the shakai kangaku, the social science, had a kind of magical power. Somehow it would unlock every mystery of society if you could study it scientifically. And that kind of realizing that it kind of gave me a focus for what I was doing. Um, it came pretty closely directly out of my dissertation, but the focus on what did this notion of social science mean in Japan, that was the discovery. Late 80s, a couple of years after I finished my dissertation, I kind of knew, okay, this is the next one. And initially, I thought I would write a kind of more comprehensive history of it, many more different sort of streams
Mhm.
of social science. But in the end, I decided to focus on the two kind of major strands. I think that's historically more accurate for the 20th century. That insofar as you get a really comprehensive approach to social science, there are two major streams, and the other ones are let's say less powerful.
So it was sort
Yeah.
of a continuous framework that did not change as you were writing the book.
No, I think I got the idea of developmental alienation. That was a comparative thing, looking at other. I think, as I say in the book, these are not societies that were colonized, but also that were empires in their own right, but nevertheless were not members of the sort of nation, the Atlantic Rim. I call them the Atlantic Rim countries, so
Yes.
Germany and Russia. Um, and Japan seemed more similar to them than it did to some of the other powerful countries that were used as models for Japan, like the United States or Great Britain or France. But in terms of how social science was organized, it seemed to me that the themes of developmental alienation were more, they were sort of more to the fore. They were the ones that the writers were
Mhm.
concerned about, constantly talked about the problem of being late or backward or something like that, even though emotionally it may not have been a very happy thing, but that was that was their perception, that we are late and we're backward and we have to do extra work to catch up. That idea. Yeah.
Yes, as I saw from your book, people in Japan had really a fascination with social sciences. They used it as a tool to discuss their lives. Do you think it was also the same in other countries? Was it the uniquely Japanese way of thought?
I don't think it's unique, and I do think it has to do with that sense of developmental lateness. Um, I got the impression that in Germany and Hungary, I think it was true in Russia, the idea of a scientific understanding of society was just such a powerful attraction because it was a way of overcoming a kind of empirical situation that people found emotionally troubling, and they felt vulnerable. And how are we going to get out of this? What can we do? Um, One of the books I read was by a late historian of Russian social thought, Alexander Vucinich, called The Quest for a General Science of Society. And it was about Russian social thought
Mhm.
in the 19th and early up until 1917. Um, and that kind of inspired me, uh, the power of sociological thinking. Yeah, no, I don't think it was unique to Japan at all. I think there's a version of it in China that we get in the 20th century that crosses from the Republican to the communist period. But similarly, the idea of the power of a scientific understanding and the issue, how do you institutionalize that? You know, that kind of issue. And beyond that, I mean, I think it was true across the world, across the industrial world, in the second half of the 19th century, that, you know, this is the way we make the future, through science applied to society. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Hmm.
you kind of making the
Yeah.
future.
Nothing unique, and it's a modern phenomenon. Yeah.
Speaking of developmental alienation and of the sense of lagging behind, do you think this is something that Japan has managed to overcome, or is it still felt inside the country?
I haven't kind of decided that. I think it seems recurrent,
Mhm.
um, because societies are never sort of uniform in their internal development. Um, and that somehow fits the sort of sense that we don't quite know where we are in the world. Japan is like that now. Um, the world of Japan facing China is very different from what it was 40 years ago. Um, so I think developmental alienation is sort of recurrent, more likely to be a recurrent phenomenon than something that you can solve. Notwithstanding the promise of social science, it's actually not solvable because there
Mhm.
is a kind of prior condition of society or human collective life that kind of makes it impossible to solve it, I would say. So it's a recurrent thing. So there'll always be social science because there's always going to be developmental alienation.
So
Yeah.
what you're saying is that every state experiences a feeling of alienation towards other states, or that is a unique problem
Yes.
of former
Yes, in
empires.
different ways. Yes, they
Mhm.
do. They do. Even the great empires, they do. They
I see.
feel, they some weak in the legs. They don't quite know, is this really going to last or not? Um, yeah, no, I think that's right.
Speaking about the empires, you give a very detailed discussion of how Japanese thinkers approached Russian philosophy and
Mm.
Russian political thought, such as the Russian interpretation of Marxism, for example.
Mhm.
But what I found interesting that you say that the Russian Revolution came as sort of surprise to them. Do you
Mhm.
remember that? Do you remember why it was so?
I think it was because they did feel, they understood, or thought they understood, that revolution would occur in the most advanced countries, that development would reach the point where revolution became the means by which history advanced to the next stage, but it didn't happen that way. Um, and so it was a surprise, and for some people, a pleasant surprise, and for others, a very unpleasant surprise, but still the idea that this master understanding of social development that looked for that, contrasted backwardness with advanced conditions and thinking that it happened in the advanced countries like Britain, that it would happen there. That's what Marx thought. And it didn't. So there was that basic empirical issue. How come it happened? How do we explain that? How do we have to modify our scientific understanding if real history contradicts it? And that's what made it the problem to me very, very interesting, I think. And Russia was the type case of that, the unexpected revolution. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, Japan also experienced its own revolution. Do you think that the social sciences somehow contributed to its stability as a state, or maybe they necessitated political changes?
They have. Yes, they have. They mean to. That's their intent.
Hmm.
It's not a contemplative enterprise. There's a practical, pragmatic side. That doesn't mean that it's not scholarly, serious scholarship, but it does mean that it's always concerned with bringing benefit, even though that may involve causing the conflicts of society to become sharper, because people will see things in a light that they're not used to. Social science has that role to disclose what is unfamiliar or unexpected in a familiar worldview and say, oh, no, I didn't realize that, right?
Yeah.
So there is that aspect to it. I think at the end of the book, I say, there's no Hippocratic oath where you can say, we didn't do any harm, right? If you disclose what society is, it may show the sides that people do not like. And so there's a price to be paid for that knowledge. But I do think that it has no other reason for existing,
Yeah,
if
but
not
also
to.
from your book, I got the impression that Japanese social sciences were very humanistic. Yeah, that there was some kind of a balance between what the state could demand and what individuals could give.
Yes, yes. I think that's right. That's part of the lineage of Marxism itself. It is actually humanistic in some ways. That was the great, right, discovery of the early Marx was the humanistic concerns. And the so-called modernists are like that too. They want to make society a happier place, more equitable distribution of goods, a better place to live. That's what they want, right? And especially coming out of, I mean, there was the pre-war version of that and really powerfully after World War II, but that sense that social science has no other reason for existing other than to make society better. So how do we do that? And the part of the answer is the state has to be involved, but the state cannot direct that process. So this is the civil society argument, right? There has to be
Mhm.
some kind of relationship between state and civil society, right? State alone cannot do it. But
Yes.
in the real world, there's
Mhm.
no place without a state. Yeah.
Yes, what he draws kind of in a position between the state and the social sciences or the thinkers who
Yeah.
think who want to limit his
Yeah.
power.
Yes. I think that's.
Yes. So it's very interesting how the Japanese people managed to maintain this balance in spite of we see other regimes such as Russia and Germany being very punishing, very strict towards their scientists. And I'm curious as to why nothing like that happened in Japan.
I think it does in Japan in the 1930s and 40s. But they handle the issue rather differently.
Mm.
Um, but still, it's a tough time to be a working social scientist in
Oh,
the
yes.
1930s, 40s compared to after or before. But the memories of that period of the 1930s and 40s are difficult for most of the people who were active because they felt under pressure from the military, from the state, and they were under pressure. There's lots of ideological pressure to conform, to say certain things a certain way.
No.
But if we, compare the means that are used, let's say
Mhm.
then yes, it doesn't look as violent, as directly violent against dissident elements. That is true.
Speaking about the two streams, Marxist and modernist, you made it sound as if they were very much alike, both wanting to make people have a better life.
Mhm.
Uh, what was the basic difference between them? Why do you single them out?
I think for the modernists, whether they accept that, label or not,
Mhm.
they felt that what was deficient in Marxism was a concern for the sort of interior condition of the individual person.
Mm.
That was their main critique. So somebody like Maruyama, whom I talk about at length, he complained, that when Marxism was in its very strongest moment in Japan in the late 40s and 50s, that the strength of Marxism seemed dependent upon what Maruyama thought was a kind of very mechanical and yes, a sort of insufficient attention to the subjective or psychological, religious and spiritual and intellectual dimensions of collective life because it's made up of individuals. And that was the main critique that they had. And that's probably why there was a separate strand. A lot of the social analysis, they accepted that the problem is to abolish backwardness. How do we do that?
Mhm.
They accepted that. They accepted the notion of class division, many, many other things that they got from the Marxists. So they are cousins, I would say. That's how I think about it now. I don't think I use that term in the book, but they are cousins. Um, and they're more similar than different, but the differences are significant. And that was the
I
main
see.
one. Yeah.
So speaking about the present time, can we see the legacy of any of these streams? Which of them was the more important for consecutive development?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think in the long run, Marxism as a way of thinking about the economy, well, it's kind of like if we think about the last 10 or 15 years, it's kind of reviving in some ways. There's a new strand of Marxism, of writing about capitalism by Japanese Marxists that is
Mhm.
part of an international trend, and it's become kind of important. But on the whole, for the post-war period, the strongest period of Marxian economics in Japan was from the late 40s until the very early 70s, and then it was sort of kind of displaced by modern economics. But modernism, because it's a little bit vaguer, it's not so much harnessed just to economic analysis. So they had
Mhm.
a more diffuse legacy. Um, Maruyama was out of fashion in a certain way in the 1980s, but even in his case and in the case of some of the other thinkers who were his colleagues and associates in those days, they are still being published, they're still being read. Um, and that sort of connects to the idea that developmental alienation never goes away. There's always going to be some relevance in these materials. And so that's kind of how I would think. But looking at it over the span of, let's say, the entire 20th century into the 21st, I don't think that Marxian economics in a narrow sense, in the way that it
Mhm.
was practiced in Japan in the 40s, late 40s and 50s and 60s, which is connected to the idea that the future lies in socialism. That part of it, I think, has fallen away. What do we
Definitely.
call the next stage? No one knows. It's a question mark, right? But the idea that you need a critique of capitalism that is urgent, it is. What else do we have except to try to figure out what is the system that we're living in, even if we don't attach it to a necessary next stage to which we attach the label socialism? That part, I think, is gone. But the basic issue of figuring out the nature of our current regime in a broad sense, that is the issue of developmental alienation, of unevenness, of inequality. All these things are current problems. That's how I look at it. So the modernist legacy is more diffuse
Mhm.
and probably in the long run, therefore, reaches into people's heads more
Right.
readily than the older model of Marxian economics.
Speaking about this process of figuring it out, what would be the main insights that we can learn from these thinkers? Maybe specifically the Russian people. I'm not sure how you're familiar with the current situation in Russia, but I'm sure our
Yeah,
readers will benefit from some lessons from these young
right.
philosophers.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to say. I mean, I know so little um, about the conditions, the sort of intellectual life in Russia. Very, very hesitant to say.
I see.
Um, the only thing is that I do feel it made me happy to see that so many of the older works of Russian social thought were being reissued
Mhm.
beginning in the 90s. They're so that was a sign, a sort of rediscovery of the traditions of Russian social thought. Um, that made me very happy. But I read Herzen and some of the other writers, but I would be very hesitant to say anything about what are the lessons for this current society. I don't know. It's a very, very difficult time to be talking about that. And
Yeah,
I'm not
sure.
informed enough to do it, I would say. Yeah.
It's now been what, more than 17 years from the publication of your book. I
Mhm.
wonder if you would have liked to change something in it, or maybe to add something that you have not covered at that time.
Yes, that's a good last question. Um, I think in some ways, on the one hand, I think don't change anything. It is what it is, and it has its fate. The other is um, there are too many things. When I reread it, I see so much that I did not understand well, where I was rushing, or
Mhm.
what about this and what about that? And those things just keep accumulating. So, so the answer is both. There's nothing and everything, I would say.
Yeah, that would certainly be very exciting for our readers. Like you could
Yeah.
write a whole new book on the same subject.
Yeah, or something I'm working now on the history of the railways in the post-war period, the reconstruction of the country after the war. A very, very different thing, and yet so many of the same problems come up. How do you organize a society to achieve a goal? And that's the perennial problem of the modern in Japan, you know.
Yeah,
How do we
no.
repair the
Mhm.
damage that's been done? Yeah,
Especially railways as a new form of movement of modern communication have always been emblematic of the new society.
it's so interesting, so fascinating, and so different. Yeah, yeah.
Do you know there is an article about you in German Wikipedia? I was wondering
In
what made in a Wikipedia, but in German, not in
Oh,
English,
I
not in
know, I
Russian.
know. I don't know why that happened. I have no idea. I've seen
I
it,
wondered
but
whether German people have read your book because it also touches about on the German
you
history
know,
of the 20th
they
century.
probably have. The number of people who work on Japanese thought is pretty small, and I have colleagues in Germany and
Mhm.
France and Britain, and one of the German colleagues may have said, "Oh, I'll do that." Yeah.
Are there any maybe special questions, last messages, last thoughts that you would love to transmit to our readers who are discovering your book for the first time?
Just that I was so happy that it happened. I never expected it. Uh, I I was happy that it got translated into Japanese,
Hmm.
but that it would be translated into Russian was a completely unexpected. And I'm very grateful for a new readership. I think it was well done. It's beautifully produced. So no, it's all upside. It's very, very, very nice.